Is that how you people always react when you ruin your clothes? So emotional? Richard Hargrove's voice slithered across the boardroom like a blade, sharp and mocking. Next, slicing through the tense silence as cola dripped from Alicia's silk blouse, the liquid spread in ugly brown stains bleeding across the ivory fabric she had chosen so carefully that morning. The spill wasn't a splash, it was a flood. Richard had leaned in too far, his entire soda can tipping, sending the sticky caramel-colored torrent cascading first over her neatly organized portfolio, before splattering directly onto her lap and chest. Alicia felt the cold wetness bite into her skin, trickling down her neck and arms in humiliating rivulets. The sensation was chilling, but the shame that followed burned hotter a roar. She sat frozen in her chair, her breath caught somewhere between shock and rage, as Richard reclined smugly in his leather seat, studying the mess like a predator admiring fresh kill. Janice from HR can clean that up, he sneered, waving a dismissive hand. That's what the help is for, right? The boardroom chuckled nervously. No one dared laugh outright, but their silence was complicit enough. Richard thrived on that silence. He had thrived on it for years. 3 years. 3 years of calculated disrespect, barbed jokes disguised as banter, promotions stolen, ideas credited to others, patience tested again and again. Day-to-day Richard had miscalculated. The Meridian Obelisk acquisition papers were already signed. The deal that would reshape the company's future was sealed, and Alicia's husband Gilbert was about to step through those polished double doors. Richard didn't know it yet, but the tide had already turned. Actually, Richard, Alicia's voice was calm, steady, deceptively soft. Her dignity held fast, even as soda soaked her blouse and clung uncomfortably to her skin. I believe today might surprise you. X. Some people mistook silence for weakness. Richard was about to learn otherwise. The 37th floor of Meridian Dynamics gleamed with cold ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Chicago's River North District in glittering steel and glass, a panorama of power and prosperity. Inside, the boardroom itself was no less theatrical polished oak, sharp suits, and 14 executives performing their daily pantomime of influence and relevance. For most, it was just that. Performance. Empty gestures, borrowed ideas, titles held together with networking and bravado. But Alicia Johnson knew better. Behind her poised smile and perfect posture, she missed nothing. The Harvard MBA hanging in her modest apartment collected dust, unseen and unacknowledged, while she fetched coffee, arranged itineraries, and typed up minutes that executives barely skimmed. She was invisible to them, and invisibility, she had learned, could be a weapon sharper than arrogance. The Q3 projections. She had crafted them. Regional Director Thompson had bragged about them. The Westfield merger, her financial modeling, his recognition. Each genius idea that had floated across this table bore her fingerprints, but her name never left anyone's lips. Richard, more than anyone, had mastered the art of theft. His expensive suits might scream power, but beneath the fabric was mediocrity. An unremarkable man buoyed only by the old boys club fraternity brothers, golf partners, and a Rolodex of favors. Failing upward was his true gift. But while Richard played politics, Alicia had been playing chess. Every microaggression, every interrupted sentence, every feigned look of surprise at her articulate points, every deliberate mispronunciation of her name, she had cataloged them all, piece by piece, move by move. And today, the board was finally hers. Dates, times, witnesses. Alicia had them all. The Obelisk Industries acquisition wasn't just another corporate merger. For her, it was something far more personal, an inflection point, a reckoning years in the making. They had never questioned why she took notes so obsessively. They assumed it was the diligence of an assistant, a secretary with no imagination of her own. They never considered that every smirk, every insult, every theft of her work was being carefully documented, stitched together into a mosaic of truth that would one day cut them open. The monthly operations review had begun like so many others. 14 executives gathered around the vast glass table, laptops glowing, expressions oscillating between boredom and predation. For most, the meeting was a game of appearances, whose tie was straighter, whose jargon sounded more important. And as always, Richard Hargrove presided with the smug ease of a man who had never truly bled for anything, who had never faced a consequence that couldn't. TB brushed away with a phone call or a round of golf. Alicia sat in her usual C10 to the table, close enough to pass out binders, far enough to be practically invisible. But today, invisibility was her shield, not her prison. My lap rested a white portfolio, the result of 17 late nights spent sifting through numbers, patterns, inefficiencies. Within those pages lay proof $2.3 million in losses. The company had swallowed in a single quarter due to negligence and mismanagement. Proof she was ready to reveal. "Before we continue," Alicia said during a rare pause, her tone measured, professional, "I've prepared an analysis that might address the revenue gap in Department 4. The temperature in the room dropped like a sudden draft. Chairs shifted, fingers stilled on keyboards. Well. Richard swiveled his chair toward her, his smile dripping with contempt. The assistant has thoughts on operations. His deliberate emphasis on assistant sent a ripple of smug amusement through the table. A few lips twitched upward, some smirks poorly concealed, others brazen. "Please," he gestured with mock courtesy, "enlighten us." Alicia rose, calm and dignified, her blouse immaculate, her shoulders squared. She carried her portfolio to the presentation screen, each step measured, purposeful. The data suggests 3 key inefficiencies. "Actually," Richard cut in smoothly, raising a hand as if silencing a child. He checked his watch with exaggerated theater. "We're running behind. Perhaps another time." Alicia didn't flinch. "It will only take 4 minutes," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "And the potential savings are substantial." Something dangerous flickered in Richard's eyes, a glint of irritation, a warning. Slowly he stood, soda can in hand. 16 ounces of carbonated spite. He strolled toward her, each step deliberate, savoring the moment, his gaze locked on her face as though daring her to move, to flinch, to falter. He stopped in front of her, the room holding its collective breath. Then, with a flick of his wrist so casual, it almost looked like carelessness, he tipped the can. The hiss of soda meeting paper, sickening splash against silk. Cola cascaded over her portfolio first, the carefully printed charts and graphs dissolving into a soggy ruin. Then it spread across her blouse, cold and sticky against her skin, staining ivory with ugly brown blotches. Gasps rippled around the table, a chorus of shock quickly swallowed by silence. "Oops." Richard didn't even glance at her. He let the word hang in the air, smirking as he scanned the faces of the other executives. His expression carried no trace of apology, only the satisfaction of dominance reaffirmed. Clumsy me. His eyes flicked down at her soaked clothes before darting toward the HR rep in the corner. "Janice can clean that up." Laughter didn't erupt, but Alicia heard it anyway in the smirks, in the silence, in the refusal of anyone to speak. 17 nights of work bled into the table, dripping onto the floor. And Richard stood tall, proud, convinced that once again he had put her in her place. He had no idea the place she was about to claim. "That's what the help is for, right?" Richard's words still lingered, oily and smug. But calculated humiliation required a calculated response. Instead of the angry outburst he clearly craved, Alicia merely reached into her pocket, withdrawing a single folded tissue. With delicate composure, she dabbed at the dark stains spreading across her blouse as though they were nothing more than an inconvenience. "These things happen," she murmured, voice low but steady, calm enough to make a few brows rise around the table. Her tone wasn't apologetic, it was unsettlingly unbothered. When her gaze finally lifted to meet Richard's, he faltered for the briefest second. There was no rage burning there, no visible humiliation. Instead, something else, something unreadable, almost dangerous. Richard couldn't have chosen a better stage for his mistake. As Janice Patterson bent down to fuss over the spill, her movements looked entirely professional, even maternal. She'd been head of HR for 15 years, she knew how to play her role to perfection. But her silver-streaked bob fell just right, concealing her lips as she leaned close. "Third drawer of his desk," she whispered. At the same time, something small and cold pressed into Alicia's palm. A black thumb drive. 7 documented promotion denials, all timed with surgical precision. Their fingers brushed briefly an oath without words. Two women sealing themselves as co-conspirators in a quiet revolution that had been brewing beneath. Meridian's polished surface for years. Janice straightened, mask sliding back into place. Her expression the same professional neutrality she always wore. "Mr. Hargrove," she said crisply, "perhaps we should take a 15-minute recess so Ms. Johnson can freshen up." Richard waved his hand, bored, dismissive. "We have a schedule. She can deal with it later." But Alicia rose anyway, excusing herself with grace. The thumb drive in her pocket felt impossibly heavy, as though it carried not just files, but 3 years of voices that had been silenced. Every buried complaint. Every minority candidate labeled not a culture fit. Every misstep of Richard's reborn as someone else's failure, while he walked away untarnished. The executive restroom was quiet, marble and chrome polished to an opulent gleam. It was the one place Meridian's power players spoke freely, certain they were beyond scrutiny. Janice had chosen her office placement for a reason close enough to catch the echoes that bounced off these cold, perfect tiles. Inside a stall, Alicia pulled out the thumb drive. Small, black, unmarked, harmless in appearance, lethal in reality. Proof that the system wasn't broken, it was rigged. The door creaked open. Voices drifted in. Instinctively, Alicia slipped the drive back into her pocket. Richard and Thomas Clifton, the CFO. "That was unnecessary," Clifton murmured, voice low, but with an edge of disapproval. "Please," Richard scoffed, water running at the sink. She needed reminding of her place. "Getting too ambitious lately." "In front of everyone," Richard Clifton pressed. Richard laughed, the sound bouncing off the marble, ugly and echoing. "What's she going to do? Complain to who? HR? Besides, after this acquisition, half this room will be redundant anyway, including your assistant with her little spreadsheets." The door swung shut behind them, leaving silence. Alicia stood alone, chest tight, but posture unbroken. She straightened her blouse as best she could, the stains setting deep into the fabric. They would not wash out. It would remain as permanent reminders of temporary humiliation. When she returned to the boardroom, the conversations hushed for a beat. Eyes darted toward her, then away. Some carried amusement, others discomfort, a few even sympathy. But Janice met her gaze directly, steady, resolute. She gave the smallest of nods confirmation, solidarity, warning. "They always underestimate the people who serve them," Janice had once told her after a particularly brutal day. "It's their blind spot, and eventually, it's their downfall." The countdown to consequences had begun. Alicia sat perfectly still, her damp blouse clinging uncomfortably to her skin, while CFO Thomas Clifton droned on about quarterly projections. But her mind was elsewhere. It drifted not to the present, but to another boardroom, 23 years earlier. Her father, Emmanuel Johnson, standing tall in his pressed navy suit, presenting an innovation that would revolutionize medical equipment across North America. His voice steady, his conviction undeniable. She had been a child then, sitting outside the glass doors, watching her father's silhouette command the room, unaware that history was being shaped before her very eyes. Now, as the numbers blurred around her, Alicia understood. This moment wasn't just about her, it was about legacy. She would not waste it. But Emmanuel Johnson never saw a penny of the fortune his brilliance created. "You've got talent, Emmanuel," they had told him, "but you lack presence. Let us handle the business side." 3 months later, his name was erased from the paperwork, his patents rebranded, repackaged. Now, belonged to the men in tailored suits who had smiled across polished tables and called themselves his partners. They built an empire on his genius, while he was quietly pushed out. Alicia remembered the night it broke him. The image was etched in her memory, more vivid than any photograph. Her father's shoulders slumped as though carrying an invisible weight, walked through the front door and set his worn briefcase down without a word. He loosened his tie with trembling fingers, the gesture slow, defeated. Then he sat at their modest kitchen table, staring at nothing. 13-year-old Alicia had stood in the doorway watching. Her mother moved silently, placing a chipped teacup in front of him, her hand resting on his shoulder in quiet solidarity. Finally, his voice cracked through the silence. "They said the paperwork was just a formality, said I could trust them, because we were partners." Alicia would never forget the way his words dissolved into the stillness of that room. or the look in his eyes, the moment when hope curdled into betrayal. Her father died years later, weakened not only by illness, but by the corrosive belief that his ideas had been worthless, because the men in suits had declared them so. Yet in those final months, he poured everything he had left into her. His frail body could no longer bear the long hours of work, but his mind burned as fiercely as ever. He taught her not just circuit design and engineering theory, but the lessons that would shape her forever. The truth about power, the necessity of proof, the art of patience. "Always keep receipts, Alicia," he would whisper, his once powerful hands thin and trembling, his eyes sharp with urgency. "They won't believe in your worth unless you force them to. Even then, they'll try to take it if you let them." She absorbed every word. Alongside differential equations and circuit theory, she mastered vigilance, documentation, and the refusal to ever again let brilliance go unacknowledged. His notebook scribbled margins, crochetted designs, fragments of equations that would one day revolutionize entire industries, still sat in her apartment, stacked carefully beside her own. Tangible proof of a man history tried to erase. Proof of what the world lost when it underestimated people like him. Harvard Business School hadn't taught Alicia those lessons. Being underestimated had. The MBA hanging in her apartment was a credential, nothing more a card to play when she chose. Harvard gave her access to networks and vocabulary, the right armor to walk among wolves. But her real education had come from Emmanuel Johnson, a man erased on paper but immortal in her resolve. Her marriage to Gilbert Johnson hadn't been calculated, but it had been fate made strategic. They had met at a tech conference where Alicia was serving coffee in a blazer borrowed from her cousin, who's already a Obelisk's rising star. But unlike everyone else in that hall, Gilbert had looked directly at her when he said, "Thank you." 2 words. But spoken as if she were a person, not part of the wallpaper. Their connection was immediate, forged in recognition. Story mirrored hers. He, too, was the son of a genius stripped of credit. His father's breakthroughs in mechanical systems had been claimed, one by one, by his white colleagues, men who rose to professorships and advisory boards, while Gilbert's father disappeared from footnotes. Gilbert had built Obelisk Industries in response, a fortress of documentation, a company where intellectual contributions were meticulously recorded, credited, protected. On their third date, over takeout cartons and scribbled notes, Gilbert had told her, "The world doesn't give people like us the benefit of the doubt. So we build systems that don't require doubt at all, just evidence." That was the moment Alicia knew they shared the same fire. He understood her ambition, not as hunger, but as inevitability. He saw her patience, her ability to think 10 moves ahead while others scrambled over scraps. When she told him of her plant to infiltrate Meridian Dynamics from the ground up, to study its weaknesses from within, he hadn't questioned her. He simply asked, "How can I help?" So she had applied to Meridian strategically, submitting only a fraction of her true qualifications. Enough to land the role of executive assistant. It's not enough to provoke the fragile egos of men like Richard Hargrove. And for 3 years, she had waited, studied, recorded, building her own system of receipts, just as her father had taught her. Now, with Obelisk on the verge of swallowing Meridian whole, Alicia's moment had finally arrived. The plan had never been about revenge. Revenge was personal, impulsive, emotional. No, this was about recalibration, about reclamation. The Meridian acquisition wasn't just business. It was restoration. It was justice. Not only for Alicia, for her father, for every woman who had ever been dismissed as the help, while her brilliance was stolen, for every man whose quiet genius had been pillaged and repackaged by those who played golf on Saturdays and called it networking. Every day at Meridian had been an exercise in strategic patience. She had kept her receipts, all of them, who interrupted whom in meetings, who rebranded whose ideas, which innovations were ignored in one voice and celebrated in another, names, dates, witnesses, patterns. Her father's silence had been born of trust. Alicia's silence was strategy, and history would not repeat itself. Richard's voice sliced through her thoughts, condescending as ever, cutting down another colleague mid-sentence. "I think what Sarah is trying to say, though not very clearly," he announced with performative patience, "is that we need to restructure the client engagement protocols." Alicia's eyes flicked to Sarah Bennett, the director of client relations. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration simmering just beneath her professional mask. Another woman diminished in real time, another name to add to the ledger. The irony bit deep. Sarah's pilot program had already increased retention by 23%. Richard had dismissed it outright, only to repackage it 3 weeks later as his own strategic insight. The thumb drive in Alicia's pocket seemed to pulse with heat, heavier than before, as though aware of the moment building. Some people mistook silence for weakness, but silence wielded correctly could be the sharpest blade. The boardroom was nearly full now, the perfect stage assembling itself. Regional managers blinked in from the massive wall screens, remote faces watching. Department heads trickled in for the acquisition update. Even CEO Maxwell Parker, who rarely attended these routine bloodlettings, had arrived. His silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses lent a gravity that settled over the room like lead. Perfect timing, perfect audience, perfect reckoning. Richard grew bolder with every passing minute, thrived on an audience, and this was the largest he'd ever had. He commandeered Sarah's financial presentation, strutting through the numbers as if they were his personal triumph. Then, with theatrical arrogance, he slid into the head seat of the table, a place traditionally reserved for Parker himself. "As I've been saying for months," Richard declared, voice booming with false confidence, "our operational efficiency needed my personal attention. And these numbers," he gestured grandly at the screen, "reflect my initiative to streamline Department 4. Alicia's fingers twitched against the polished wood of the table. Department 4's streamlining had been hers, her ideas, planted like seeds into middle management, watered carefully until they believed them their own. 43% revenue growth, dressed in Richard's expensive suit. Every interruption, every stolen idea, every dismissal, these had not been random humiliations. They had been bricks, stacked one by one into the wall now surrounding Richard. And today, she held the key to bring it all down. Her pocket burned with the weight of evidence. 7 promotion denials. 17 thefts of intellectual credit. 23 complaints filed, then buried. Numbers, dates, specifics, an architecture of accountability strong enough to collapse a kingdom. CEO Maxwell Parker glanced at his watch, his irritation thinly veiled. "When is the obelisk representative arriving?" he asked sharply. "We should have heard something by now." "Their CFO called earlier," Alicia offered, her voice quiet, professional, perfectly timed. "He confirmed everything remains on schedule."
Nice.
Richard's eyes flicked toward her, venomous. "Perhaps leave executive communications to the executives." Alicia. She lowered her gaze with practiced obedience. Of course. But the silver watch on her wrist, Gilbert's gift, their first anniversary, ticked on with merciless precision, each second pushing the room closer to impact. Around the table, the atmosphere shifted. Some executives straightened their papers unnecessarily, nervous energy in the shuffle. Others leaned back, feigning nonchalance but tapping pens too quickly, blinking too often. They could sense it, the balance tilting, the storm gathering just beyond those glass doors. And Alicia sat perfectly still, the eye of it. Each person around the table understood what mergers really meant. Redundancies, restructuring, reassessment. Behind every calm expression sat a private storm of fear. Urs dangled in the balance. But Richard Hargrove's voice cut through the tension with his usual arrogance. "I don't anticipate significant changes to our leadership structure," he declared, his tone bloated with unearned confidence. "I've spoken personally with Obelisk's board members. They value our operational expertise." Lie? A bold, effortless lie. The board had never spoken to Richard. Every communication had been carefully routed through proper channels. Channels Alicia herself had monitored and controlled with surgical precision. The shrill ring of the conference room phone sliced through the air like a blade. The sound startled even the most stoic executives, shattering the fragile illusion of control. Alicia reached for the receiver, her movements fluid, practiced, masking the quickening of her pulse. "Meridian Dynamics, 37th floor boardroom," she said, her voice calm as glass. Pause, then a subtle nod. "Yes, I understand. I'll inform them immediately." When she placed the receiver down, she did so with deliberate care, as if lowering the weight of inevitability itself. Every gaze snapped toward her. "The obelisk representative is on his way up," she announced. "He just cleared security in the lobby." The room shifted on its axis. Chairs squeaked. Papers fluttered. Richard straightened his tie one final time, his fingers obsessively tugging the Windsor knot, until it sat with surgical precision. He had no way of knowing it was the last time he would wear Meridian credentials around his neck. The sound of expensive shoes echoed in the hallway, not hurried, not hesitant, measured, certain. With each step, conversation evaporated until silence consumed the boardroom entirely. 14 pairs of eyes locked on the door, their collective breath suspended in the charged air. The elevator dinged, the handle turned, and Gilbert Johnson stepped into view. The silence deepened, thickened. It wasn't merely quiet now, it was reverent. Gilbert filled the doorway with effortless presence. 6'2", broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered restrained wealth. In his hand, a black leather portfolio embossed with the Obelisk Industries crest, the mark of power carried without flourish. But what struck everyone wasn't the tailoring, or the stature, or the logo. It was the stillness. He did not fidget. He did not need to clear his throat, adjust his cufflinks, or stride theatrically. His presence was gravitational, bending the room toward him. Where Richard's confidence was inflated and noisy, Gilbert's authority was quiet, unshakable, real. Where Maxwell Parker leaned on silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses to construct an image of gravitas, Gilbert needed nothing but himself. Richard, desperate to reclaim the stage, forced himself forward, hand outstretched, and smile too wide. Richard Hargrove, VP of Operations. We've been looking forward to finalizing this deal. Gilbert's eyes dropped to the offered hand. 1 second. 2. Just long enough to slice through Richard's facade. Then he accepted with a handshake, neither firm nor weak, just perfectly measured. A handshake that conveyed balance, discipline, and choice. Gilbert Johnson, he said after a pause, his voice a controlled resonance that filled the room without rising. CEO of Obelisk Industries. I believe you've been working with my team for several months now. The words landed with the force of revelation. A subtle gasp escaped someone at the table. Paper crinkled under nervous fingers. Expressions shifted like tectonic plates, professional masks faltering into surprise, uncertainty, even awe. The acquisition had been carefully orchestrated through intermediaries, faceless lawyers, and finance teams. No one had expected the man himself, the CEO, the power behind the name. What should have been a routine formality had just transformed into something else entirely. A reckoning. Richard's smile faltered, the practiced confidence thinning around the edges. CEO, we were expecting your CFO or perhaps the acquisition team lead. I prefer to handle significant transitions personally, Gilbert replied, his voice smooth as polished steel. His gaze swept the room, steady and unhurried, pausing briefly on Alicia before moving on. If he noticed the faint coffee stains on her blouse, his expression betrayed nothing. Instead, he delivered the next line with surgical precision, particularly when the investment reaches $47 million. Not around 50, not nearly 50. Exactly 47 million. The specificity landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the executives seated around the table. It revealed not only mastery of detail, but a level of engagement most CEOs would never bother with. This was no figurehead parachuting in for photographs. This was a man who had memorized the fine print. The suspicion began to shift. Obsessive micromanager, or a leader whose command of information was absolute. Around the table, the second answer was winning. Maxwell Parker, Meridian's own CEO, moved forward hastily, eager to contain the imbalance. Mr. Johnson, we're honored. Had we known you were coming personally, we would have prepared accordingly. No additional preparation is necessary, Gilbert replied without glancing at him. He placed his portfolio on the table with deliberate calm. The terms have already been reviewed by both parties. All that remains is implementation. The $47 million question hung unspoken in the air. Everyone knew what acquisitions meant. Restructuring, realignments, bloodletting in the form of pink slips. Each executive was silently calculating their odds of survival as their eyes tracked Gilbert's movements like prey watching a predator. Richard, unwilling to fade into the background, gestured eagerly toward the glowing presentation screen. I've taken the liberty of outlining our integration strategy. My operations team has identified several before we continue, Gilbert interrupted. The words so smoothly delivered they erased Richard's sentence midair. I'd like to address an administrative matter. He turned toward Alicia. His expression was unreadable, yet charged with intent. Miss Johnson, would you join us at the table, please? The authority in his voice was so natural, so effortless, that Richard stopped speaking without protest. Only a heartbeat later did the implication hit him. The CEO of Obelisk Industries had just addressed their assistant by name. Confusion rippled through the room. Brows furrowed, heads tilted. Richard's face hardened into a mask. Our assistant can take notes from her usual position, he said, his tone clipped, defensive. Gilbert's expression didn't change, but the air did. It was subtle, like the drop in barometric pressure before a storm. I believe, Gilbert said, each word measured with mathematical precision, that I was addressing Ms. Johnson directly. The correction wasn't heated. It wasn't sharp. Didn't need to be. Its restraint was its power. And in that moment, Richard's authority was stripped bare, his interruption reduced to irrelevance. Alicia rose. She did so with the quiet grace of someone who had spent years being underestimated, coffee stains and all. The room shifted to accommodate her. Chairs scraping hastily aside, the executives exchanged wary glances. Confusion in some, curiosity in others, calculation in a few. Thomas Clifton, the CFO, leaned toward Maxwell Parker, murmuring words that made the CEO's eyebrows twitch upward. Sarah Bennett, ever the strategist, sat straighter, her neutral mask betraying only the faintest tightening around the eyes. Gilbert, unhurried, opened his portfolio and slid a folder across the polished mahogany surface, until it rested in front of Alicia. Perhaps you'd like to explain the terms of the acquisition to your colleagues. The request landed like a thunderclap in the silence. 5 long seconds stretched, the weight of them pressing down on every chest in the room. Richard broke first. His laugh spilled out. Sharp, too loud, brittle at the edges. Mr. Johnson, with all due respect. Complex financial arrangements might be better explained by those with appropriate qualifications. I agree completely, Gilbert replied, his tone pleasant, immovable. Which is precisely why I'm asking Ms. Johnson to walk us through them. The implication detonated across 14 faces at once. Some masked their shock quickly, retreating behind poker faces. Others failed, eyes widening, lips parting. Maxwell Parker's expression shifted toward calculation, his gaze snapping between Gilbert, Alicia, and the folder that now sat before her like a live grenade. Alicia accepted it with steady hands. She opened it carefully, reverently, and withdrew the acquisition agreement, bearing signatures from both boards. The room froze. The moment crystallized around her, a single point of focus. What had begun as a boardroom routine had just transformed into revelation. 3 years of quiet calculation, of biting her tongue and swallowing indignities, had all funneled into this single, razor-sharp moment. Alicia stood as Gilbert passed her the folder, her hand steady, despite the storm building in her chest.
Allow me to introduce myself properly,
she began, her voice carrying with crystalline clarity through the boardroom's vaulted silence. Alicia Johnson, Harvard MBA, architect of the Westfield merger that saved this company last year. And as of this morning, she paused, letting the silence thicken. Owner of Meridian Dynamics. The words detonated in the room. Gasps, shifting chairs, the soft exhalations of disbelief. Alicia allowed the shock to bloom before delivering the final cut. The coffee, Richard, is on your desk. You can pour your own from now on. Richard's skin drained so quickly, it was as if the blood had abandoned him mid-battle. We turned to Maxwell Parker with wild, desperate eyes. This is absurd. Max, what is this? But Parker was no longer Richard's ally. His face had already settled into that polished neutrality of a man who understood power when it changed hands. The board approved this acquisition last week, Richard. It's been in motion for months. Richard stammered, hand trembling as he gestured toward Alicia. She's just... Words failed him. The foundation of his reality cracked beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. The woman he dismissed, belittled and humiliated, was no longer beneath him. She was above him. Under the terms finalized this morning, Alicia continued, her tone calm but laced with undeniable steel. Obelisk Industries now holds controlling interest in Meridian Dynamics. Effective immediately, the corporate structure will undergo significant reorganization. She let the words linger before turning her gaze direct, unwavering onto Richard. For 3 years, she had trained herself not to meet his eyes. Now she held them without flinching. "Perhaps," she said slowly, almost savoring the syllables, "you'd like to explain the soda incident to our new CEO?" The air turned electric. Head swiveled toward Richard, whose forced laugh came out brittle and hollow. "Harmless accident," he croaked. "Nothing worth, I disagree," Gilbert interrupted, his calm voice cutting sharper than a blade. "In my experience, small accidents reveal far more about leadership than any polished mission statement." He gestured at Alicia's still-stained blouse. "Would you care to elaborate on how this accident occurred?" Silence swallowed the room. 14 executives sat paralyzed, not a single one willing to tether themselves to Richard's sinking ship. Richard fiddled pointlessly with the papers before him. "It was a misunderstanding. We were rushed. The materials." Actually, a new voice cut in, measured and firm. All eyes shifted to Janice, the head of HR, who rose with a folder clasped in her hands. For years, she had sat through meetings silently, her authority respected, but rarely tested. Now, she stepped forward with the quiet gravitas of someone who had been waiting for justice to arrive. "I believe I can provide some context." Richard's eyes widened in horror. "Janice, this isn't the time," but Janice didn't stop. She laid the folder on the polished wood. 7 qualified candidates passed over for promotion, each with superior credentials to the individuals ultimately selected. Documented here, with dates, qualifications, and your personal objections, Mr. Hargrove. The room tightened. Richard's throat bobbed as if he were drowning. Janice opened a second file, her tone unflinching. 17 instances of intellectual property appropriation, strategies and proposals developed by others presented as your own. She turned a page with surgical precision. And 23 documented complaints of misconduct, including this morning's incident. 12 witnesses, all seated in this room. Richard's pallor shifted from pale to corpse-like gray. His voice cracked, baseless. "All of it. I've never seen these documents." "That's correct," Janice said, her composure razor-sharp. "Because you systematically removed them from official records." She closed the file with deliberate finality. "Fortunately, I kept copies." Gilbert extended his hand, accepting the files. His eyes scanned the pages with the focused attention of a man who missed nothing, who weighed every detail against truth itself. The silence in the boardroom had become something alive, pressing down on Richard like a suffocating fog. Alicia counted the seconds in her head. 47. That was how long. Gilbert studied Janice's meticulously kept records before he finally closed the folder. "Mr. Hargrove," Gilbert said, voice as calm and precise as a scalpel, "would you prefer to review this evidence before or after your termination?" Richard shot to his feet, the wheels of his chair screeching against the polished floor. "This is a coordinated attack." His voice cracked like splintering glass. He turned to Maxwell Parker, desperation bleeding into rage. "Maxwell, surely you're not allowing this madness." But Parker wouldn't look at him. He adjusted his tie, his eyes fixed on the table. "The board has approved the acquisition. Mr. Johnson holds controlling interest now." Richard's breath hitched, his fury redirecting to Alicia like a blade. "This is personal. You planned this." "This isn't personal," Gilbert replied evenly, unmoved by the venom. "It's mathematical. The documentation speaks for itself. 16 ounces of soda have indeed cost you millions." The precision of the remark landed like a death sentence. Richard flinched. Around the table, not a soul stirred in his defense. Gilbert turned to the room, his voice carrying the weight of irrevocable authority. "Meridian Dynamics will undergo immediate restructuring. Some positions will be eliminated, others created. All decisions will be based on documented performance, ethical conduct, and demonstrable contribution." Richard's complexion had shifted beyond pale. It was the shade of career, detachation, hollow, final. Professional consequences came with professional precision. Within 30 minutes of Gilbert's announcement, security personnel arrived carrying pre-printed badges for the restructured organization. The efficiency was staggering, proof that this coup had been engineered with months of exacting detail. Every contingency rehearsed until inevitability felt like destiny. "Danis Patterson," Gilbert declared, handing her the first badge. is appointed Executive Vice President of Personnel Operations effective immediately. Janice's composure barely concealed the tremor in her hands as she accepted the badge. 15 years of careful note-taking, of documenting injustices she could never act upon, now culminated in vindication so sharp it made her chest ache. Sarah Bennett, Gilbert continued, was promoted to Chief Operating Officer. Overseeing all functions previously managed by Mr. Hargrove, Sarah blinked, stunned. For years, her strategies had been discarded, her innovations dismissed until Richard repackaged them as his own. Now, her quarterly plan, the one he had ridiculed before stealing, would be implemented under her direct command. Resolve straightened her posture as she accepted the role. One by one, Gilbert elevated those who had labored unseen in Richard's shadow. Marcus Chen, the quiet innovator whose ideas had been stolen too many times to count, was named Chief Innovation Officer. Daria Williams, whose financial models had rescued the company's bottom line only for Richard to hoard the credit, came head of strategic finance. It was a parade of vindication, each promotion a blade slicing deeper into the illusion of Richard's indispensability. Meanwhile, Richard stood mute, a man watching his empire collapse beam by stolen beam. His silence wasn't dignity, it was paralysis. The realization that the fortress he'd built was nothing but scaffolding held together by other people. His brilliance. Your access to company systems has been revoked, Alicia informed him at last, her tone professional, surgical. Your personal items will be packed and couriered to your residence tomorrow. You can't do this, Richard sputtered, arrogance cracking to reveal the shriveled insecurity beneath. I built this division. I hold the relationships with every major client. Correction, Alicia said, her eyes never leaving the page in her hand. Her voice carried no malice, only the precision of truth. You claimed credit for building this division? Those client relationships were established and nurtured by the very team members you ignored, belittled, and exploited. The recognition you hoarded was never yours to begin with. The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and undeniable. Gilbert approached the table with deliberate calm, an envelope in hand, extended it toward Richard like a judge presenting a final verdict. Your termination package, Gilbert said, his tone clinical. You'll find it's exactly in line with company policy, neither punitive nor generous. Termination isn't just a word, Mr. Hargrove, it's 27 pages of legal documentation. 27 pages outlining the end of one reality. It's the beginning of another. Richard didn't take it. His jaw tightened. This will never stand, he spat. My attorney will. Your attorney is welcome, Gilbert interrupted smoothly, to review all documentation, including the evidence of systematic discrimination, intellectual property appropriation. And today's assault, which, I should note, was witnessed by 14 people. The word assault landed with surgical precision. It wasn't just termination anymore. It was exposure, prosecution, ruin. Richard's face twitched as the implications sank in, his bluster faltering for the first time. Security will escort you to the lobby, Alicia said, gesturing toward the door where two uniformed officers waited, their presence quiet but immovable. Your personal devices will remain with IT for standard data retention procedures. Richard's body stiffened as the officers flanked him. His expression, cycled rage, disbelief, denial before settling into something heavier, darker, comprehension. This wasn't sabotage, this was consequence. The empire he had stolen brick by brick was now collapsing on top of him, and he was trapped beneath the rubble of his own making. As the doors closed behind him, silence thickened in the boardroom. The executives who remained stared at one another as though the very walls had shifted. The ground beneath their careers had cracked open, revealing a new fault line of power. Maxwell Parker cleared his throat, voice dry, desperate. Mr. Johnson. Given these developments, perhaps we should discuss my position as well. Gilbert regarded him with the patience of a man filing evidence. Your awareness of these issues without corrective action has been noted. We'll discuss transition arrangements privately. The message was clear. No one was untouchable. At precisely 3:07 p.m., Richard's access badge deactivated. The system log recorded the exact second his authority evaporated. Years of power reduced to a timestamp in an IT archive. In the boardroom, Alicia stood beside Gilbert as they addressed the reassembled leadership team. Competence was always here, she said, her voice low but steady. You simply refused to see it. Sometimes justice arrives wearing a tailored suit. and carrying 27 pages of termination paperwork. 3 weeks later, company insiders had given it a name: the recalibration. The 37th floor of Meridian Dynamics was no longer haunted by Richard's shadow. The physical space hadn't changed. Same floor-to-ceiling windows. Same glass table for 14, but the energy had been rewritten. Conversations no longer carried the brittle edge of fear. Ideas surfaced freely, unchoked by politics. Talent that had been silenced now hummed with life. Alicia Johnson, newly appointed Executive Vice President of Strategic Development, stood at the window overlooking Chicago's River North District. The view hadn't changed, but her perspective had. Her reflection in the glass was no longer the woman with a stained blouse, humiliated in silence. It was the reflection of earned authority, shoulders squared, posture confident, eyes unflinching. The morning sun caught on the skyline, transforming glass facades into mirrors of fire and turning the Chicago River into a ribbon of light. From 37 floors up, the city stretched below like a living system, each building, each street, each intersection serving its purpose. Meridian now mirrored that same design, restructured, recalibrated, purposeful. "The Anderson proposal looks promising," Gilbert said, joining her at the window. His reflection appeared beside hers in the glass, two figures standing where fear once ruled, now architects of something new. "Sarah's team has done exceptional work structuring the terms," Gilbert said, his tone warm but understated. "They always had the capacity," Alicia replied, eyes on the city skyline beyond the glass. "They just needed the space to demonstrate it." The operational restructuring had already yielded results that were impossible to ignore. With talent finally recognized and deployed where it belonged, efficiency soared 27% in just 21 days. Client retention strengthened, now managed by those who had built the relationships rather than by those claiming credit. The Westfield merger, Alicia's architectural vision executed through careful intermediaries, finally stabilized under proper leadership. But numbers, while impressive, were only half the story. The cultural transformation was profound. The anxious hush that had once clung to the 37th floor like a fog had lifted, replaced by purposeful energy. Ideas were attributed to their rightful creators. Contributions mattered more than connections. Authority was measured by competence, not posturing. From her new office, formerly Richard, corner suite, Alicia could see the principles she fought for taking shape in real time. Department meetings no longer resembled arenas of dominance and interruption. Ideas were weighed on merit, not on the loudest voice. The metrics spoke for themselves. 43% increase in employee contributions during brainstorming sessions. 27% reduction in meeting time with enhanced productivity outcomes, 19%. Improvement in interdepartmental collaboration. Measured, quantified, documented, visible, irrefutable. Gilbert stepped to the window, standing beside her, quiet pride in his posture. "Your father would be proud," he said softly, knowing the weight behind her every decision. Alicia allowed herself a brief, private acknowledgement of the emotions swelling inside. Her father, Emmanuel Johnson, had always said, "Dignity speaks softly, but carries documentation." On her desk, a framed photograph of him in his workshop caught the morning light. He was surrounded by circuit designs that should have made him wealthy but never did. Beside it, a small display case held one of his original circuit board. Efficient, revolutionary. Gilbert had given it to her on the day the acquisition finalized. Tangible symbol of legacy transformed into methodology. Patient, precise, unstoppable. "Have you heard from Richard?" Gilbert asked casually, though Alicia could sense the careful attention behind the question. She shook her head. His attorney contacted legal last week about the termination package. They've apparently decided not to pursue further action. The decision wasn't surprising. After reviewing the 27 pages of meticulously documented misconduct, Richo's attorney must have concluded that any litigation would be catastrophic for his client's reputation. Dates, times, witnesses, patterns of behavior. Clear violations of company policy, potentially state labor laws, evidence that could not be erased or refuted. And Maxwell, Gilbert inquired. He accepted the retirement package, Alicia replied. His official statement acknowledged oversight failures in corporate culture management and expressed support for the new leadership structure. A calm sense of justice filled the room. The floor was no longer a place of fear or politics. It was a place of measured competence, documented accountability, and earned authority. From her corner of the 37th floor, Alicia allowed herself a rare, private smile. Her father's lessons hadn't just been honored, they had reshaped reality itself. Self-preservation had ultimately guided Maxwell Parker's response. Rather than fight the inevitable, he positioned himself as supportive of necessary change, negotiating a dignified exit while preserving public face. It was the calculated response of a man who understood when the game had irrevocably shifted. From her vantage point, Alicia observed the transformation unfold like a meticulously choreographed symphony. Janice mentored the expanded HR team, implementing protocols designed to prevent future Richards from thriving. Sarah led a department meeting where every contribution was acknowledged, credited, and celebrated. Marcus Chen collaborated with his engineering team, the whiteboards covered in annotated designs, each component signed by its creator visual manifesto of intellectual recognition. Culture was changing, one deliberate action at a time. True success, Alicia reflected, wasn't just what you achieved, it was how you achieved it. Power didn't need to humiliate, dominate, or belittle. That afternoon, she led her first executive committee meeting in the very boardroom where Richard had poured soda weeks earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. 16 ounces of arrogance had cost him a career, a reputation, and the illusion of competence. "Before we begin," she said, taking her place at the head of the table, her voice calm, but resolute, "let's establish a fundamental principle for leadership moving forward. Respect isn't given by title, it's earned through character. Merit isn't measured by volume, it's measured by value." Around the table, 14 faces, a mix of familiar and new, nodded in quiet understanding. It had undergone an ethos shift. Sarah Bennett, now Koo, presented the quarterly strategy she had developed, the same one Richard had previously dismissed and misappropriated. Daria Williams outlined supporting financial projections. Marcus Chen detailed the technical implementation timeline. Each spoke without interruption. Each received feedback and questions, meticulously recorded with proper attribution. The contrast to past meetings was stark, where Richard had once dominated with performative confidence, intimidation, and interruptions. Gilbert and Alicia now led through observation, precision, and validation. Ideas were assessed for impact, not ego. Collaboration replaced competition. Patience and strategy had triumphed over bluster and entitlement. 3 years of meticulous planning had culminated in decades of transformation. Every slight endured, every coffee poured, every detail documented worth it. As the meeting concluded, Alicia lingered at the table, watching the executives filter out in purposeful clusters, exchanging insights rather than jockeying for position. The glass conference table, once stained by Richard's arrogance, reflected the afternoon sunlight in geometric patterns, quiet testament to earned excellence. "Excellence speaks for itself," Alicia told her remaining team, her voice soft but firm, but documentation proves it. "Take note of your contributions, they form the foundation of your worth. Some battles are won with patience, not volume. Some victories are measured in dignity, not decibels." A subtle, satisfied smile touched her lips as she glanced at the city's skyline beyond the windows. The Chicago River glittering like a ribbon of light. Meridian Dynamics was no longer just a company, it was a statement. And for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, Alicia's story stood as proof. Patience is not weakness. Strategy is power. And justice, when carefully documented, is inevitable.